This podcast is sponsored by Xgrowth. Xgrowth is the APAC ABM agency. If you and your organization are looking to land and expand enterprise and mid-market deals, Xgrowth is the agency to help. Xgrowth works with a wide range of international and global technology vendors, service providers, and B2B SaaS companies. If this sounds like something you're interested to know more about, make sure to check out Xgrowth at xgrowth.com.au. That's xgrowth.com.au and chat with the APAC ABM agency.
What's up, marketers, and welcome to another episode of the Growth Colony podcast. I'm Liza from Xgrowth to tell you that each episode we bring in B2B leaders to chat about how you can achieve those everyday wins in the marketing world. Whether you're new to the B2B game, working at a leadership level, or even just showing some interest, we know you'll love the episode. So grab a drink, get comfy, and enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode. I'm Shane Holler with Xgrowth, and today I'm talking to Taryn Williams, co-founder at Gifted. Second time on the podcast. Very excited. And also Joe Rezendi, senior software engineer at Gifted, about how to take your B2B influencer marketing to the next level. On that note, let's dive in. Joe and Taryn, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for having me back after last time.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Joe, thank you as well.
Super excited to be here.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you here. And it doesn't happen often that we have software engineers on the podcast. Now, I should say, for anyone who's listening, Joe is a marketer turned software engineer with a lot of experience in influencer marketing. And so I'm super excited to kind of get your feedback on what we're talking about today. But let's start with kind of the first question of really love to get your thoughts on what do you think in terms of the approach that B2B marketers need to take when it comes to influencers and influencer marketing. It is an area that is very strong in B2C, and we get exposed to it quite heavily in B2C. But what are your thoughts in terms of, is there a difference, or what do you think B2B marketers should approach influencers? How should they approach influencers?
Yeah, and I think there's a common misconception, right, that influencer marketing is only suitable for B2C, when obviously there's always an influencer that's suitable for a brand. It's about finding the right suitable person for your campaign and who's going to impact that decision maker. And the reason I think it's really, really important for B2B marketers is that there's so many more touch points that you need in your sales journey as a general rule than a simple B2C product where you're like, buy this lipstick, it's $10.95 versus buy this software package that is a, 6-week install process and involves you changing all of your processes. The research and purchasing decision of that consumer is going to be so much longer and require so many more touch points. So if you can integrate influencer marketing to all of that funnel, the top of the funnel, middle and bottom, I think that there's so many powerful ways that you can obviously reach new customers, start moving them through the funnel and increase conversions through things like testimonials and, advocacy through these sort of really credible B2B influencers. So I think it is slightly more complicated to think about using influencers from a B2B perspective, but I certainly think it's not something that should be thrown out the window or just pigeonholed into only being done on LinkedIn as well.
Okay. That's very interesting. Joe, what are your thoughts on that front?
I think from kind of a broad strokes approach, business to business marketing in general is slightly different than business to consumer marketing. But at the end of the day, people that are in charge of making purchasing decisions at companies watch the same type of content that, consumers do. But you might need to pick a different niche. So on that about LinkedIn, thinking about thought leaders, industry experts, and professionals that might have a genuine following within your niche. When I think of who I want to market to from a product, I take a look at the list of newsletters that I'm currently reading as a business professional to gain insights into my own community. A lot of time, there's going to be overlap with the other companies that you want to reach. So if you're looking for who is that thought leader? Look at who you're already following.
That is such a good point.
I couldn't agree more. I think there's this idea that, let's say your purchasing decision maker is the CTO in an organization, that person stops being the CTO when they leave and go home for the day and they start consuming content on TikTok or on YouTube. Like, that person is still a person. They're still consuming content on all of these different channels. So how can you find ways to speak to them in meaningful ways across all of those different channels? So I'm not just thinking about, what am I interested in from a business perspective because I'm purely reading LinkedIn right now. As Joe said, I'm reading a newsletter that I'm really interested in. It might not be specifically about finding a new software platform, but I see an article in there that's really interesting on, AI trends or something that I want to read anyway, and it happens to feature information about your software product. Like, I think thinking about those different touch points and that person doesn't stop being that decision maker at the end of the day when they leave their, 9 to 5 or 8 till 7 role, that they are still that decision maker across all of these different platforms.
And I think on that too, Taryn, there's a much more diverse type of collaboration that's available in the B2B influencer marketing side of things than maybe B2C. Going into guest blog posts or co-hosting webinars or kind of like joint research interview type things. There's a lot of ways to keep content fresh in this space that might not be considered.
So I definitely want to talk about, the different approaches and how that applies. And I feel like we've kind of touched on this a little bit, my next question, which I'd love to hear in terms of what are the differences. So we talked about what are the similarities, that, hey, the CIO who is in their office when they go home, they don't change. They're the same person, whether it's in the office or at home, and therefore a lot of the similar approaches and the mindset that marketers need to think about can apply across the both spectrum, being direct to consumer or B2B. But what are your thoughts in terms of the differences between the two spaces when it comes to influencer marketing?
Yeah, with a B2B product, I think it probably does require a more involved sales cycle, usually, more touch points, as I sort of said earlier, but also a more involved decision-making process that usually involves different stakeholders in the organization as well. And so I think, some of the things Joe touched on earlier in terms of things like co-hosting webinars, podcast series is a fantastic information that can be a little bit more longer form content and that can engage different decision makers at different parts of that process. So, you might co-host a webinar with a company that is, has an aligned customer vertical to you, and perhaps that's more broad and it's designed to reach potentially, all of your engineering team as a general awareness piece. And then you might create more and more granular content that comes down the funnel, like a much more involved white paper, for example, that is really speaking to that CIO. So I think that the similarities are the same in that obviously we're looking for things like how do we build trust? How do we build credibility? How do we reach new audiences? How do we move them through the funnel? But then I think the differences are that you're going to need to convey much more information in a still engaging and digestible way than you maybe need to in a B2C campaign.
I loved what you said about the sales cycle and how that works at like a larger business or organization, right? It is longer. It does involve several decision makers, right? And so you can target different parts of those companies, right? When I think of how we bring in products that we use at Hash Gifted, all of it starts as there's an engineer that needs something that the CTO has never heard of before. So it's not just about targeting that CTO, the CEO role, or even anybody in the executive suite. Sometimes it starts from sending out ads or pieces of content that are relevant to, the individual contributors at the lowest levels of the organization, because a lot of times these products get passed upwards to the decision makers and it doesn't come from top down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of the number of times where I've been retargeted with a new software or a new tool because my algorithm is different to Joe's, which is different to someone else's in our organizations. Sometimes I'll see a piece of content on LinkedIn or Instagram or TikTok, and I'll come back to the engineering team and say, hey, have you seen this tool before? Could this be useful to us? Or to the sales team and say, hey, there's this great new outreach tool or, content deliverable tool. Have you guys seen this before? And so I think, being able to touch those different points of the organization and not being so, I think perhaps laser focused on just the decision maker being the only person in the organization that you need to speak to, that frequently it can come from a demand within the organization that floats these, products or services up to the decision maker.
I love that. And, I also do that to my team, and I feel like sometimes they really don't like when I do it. It's just like, here we go. What new thing has Shaheen come across that now we have to look at and see if it makes sense to incorporate and learn and all that stuff. But I totally agree with you. One of the things that I wanted to kind of talk about is a lot of influencer marketing in the B2B space, I've noticed, and you've touched on that a little bit on the awareness, is that it is not focused as much at the very bottom of the funnel, where we see that in direct to consumer, where it's like, hey, I bought this couch and, click on the link and go make the purchase, or I've bought this other thing and check this out on Instagram. And there's a lot of transaction that happens, and therefore the measurement for the ROI from a kind of B2C or direct to consumer influencer might be different than measuring the success of a B2B influencer. What are your thoughts in terms of the measurement component?
And I think this is always the $1 million question with any kind of influencer marketing campaigns as well, right? Whether it's B2C or B2B, but it's certainly harder to track in B2B. Again, I think it comes down to what the sales cycle looks like and the cost of the product, and how involved that decision needs to be and how many stakeholders. I'm sure if you're talking about a higher value piece of software or a product that, is got a longer sales cycle, then potentially how you're measuring success is, the new number of leads generated for the sales team to go out and then have a, one-on-one with, like a physical face-to-face meeting, for example. Hash Gifted itself is a B2B business, right? Like we are, whilst we have content creators are one part of our business, but predominantly who we sell to are brands who are looking for a tool like Hash Gifted to manage their contra gifting campaigns and their UGC creation. So when we're doing an influencer collaboration and having our influencers talk about our product or having other businesses create case studies and pieces of content like that, we're looking for direct new signups because it's a relatively low cost platform. We don't expect those people to need an onboarding sales call, but we know that they will certainly need other touch points. They'll come to the website, they're going to read a number of pages on the website, probably look at pricing, and then we're going to retarget them with some online ads and look at reducing that acquisition cost over time. So I think it really depends on the cost of the product or service. I'm sure Xero is probably, and Monday.com and platforms like that are really looking for quite a direct attribution from influencer creates some piece of content, whether it's a blog or a post or whatever it might be, and it really drives direct signups. And then, larger products or platforms are probably looking for, number of new inquiries or white paper downloads or newsletter signups or event attendance, things like that are probably, much more, top of funnel for their sales team to then go and qualify and turn into leads.
Got it. What do you think are some of the mistakes that people make? And I feel like we've maybe indirectly touched on some of the things, but what do you think some of the mistakes that you see quite regularly marketers make when they're approaching or thinking about rolling out an influencer marketing program in B2B?
Joe, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, especially because you get to see it from both sides. Yeah. As someone who is a B2B decision maker in our organization in terms of the products and services that we sign up to, but also as a marketer or ex-marketer yourself and a content creator. I would love to hear what you think.
Yeah, I think I can definitely speak about this from kind of a content creating perspective. The first thing that sticks out to me is just having a lack of alignment. I think some of that comes from shooting across the board to try to, you send 50 messages to 50 different creators or influencers and see if any of them bite and are interested. But I can't tell you how many times as more of a gaming personality, I get things about, women's makeup. Will you advertise this on your YouTube channel? Things of that nature. So having a good alignment on influencers that share your values and audience and obviously expertise is definitely essential. But then I think beyond that, it's having too short term of a focus. changing your customer acquisition cost is not something that's going to happen overnight after posting some piece of user-generated content, right? It kind of needs to be more about the long-term lead generation and developing that relationship with an influencer. It's just the same way as if we listen to ads from more and more often, right? Well, it'll become more imbued in our mind the next time we're thinking of a solution that we can use. We typically watch the same content creators over and over as well. I go through, a couple the same YouTube channels every week, and it's usually always the same types of ads, and those are the products that I'll consider over something I've heard about once. And then I think the other thing is just about over-scripted content, and like the micromanaging of influencers, which can kind of like hinder the authenticity that you might be trying to convey. I think that creators have their own voice, and if you can kind of take advantage of that because they know how to speak to their audience already, giving them more creative freedom is probably one of the best ways to have them actually connect with the audience that you're trying to connect to.
I totally agree with that. And I think from a brand perspective, the having to go out and source and find new creators over and over again, especially in the B2B space, can be really challenging. And I think, as Joe touched on, building those long-term relationships where it can be really mutually beneficial, where you find a B2B influencer and you say, instead of just engaging them to do, one webinar and one LinkedIn post, for example, you actually sit down and map out, okay, what does your company roadmap look like for the next 12 months or 24 months? How could we mutually add value to each other's audiences? What could we talk about? How can we build a marketing plan on both sides that is going to really add value? That this creator or influencer can speak to with authority. And as Joe was sort of saying, they know their audience so well. So I think when you work really collaboratively with them, you'll often find an influencer can say, hey, actually, like, I know a lot of my audience have been asking about top tips for hiring, or, how to use AI in their businesses, or whatever it might be. How can we work collaboratively on some content that's going to answer those questions and incorporate your business? So I think building more meaningful, longer term relationships instead of that ad hoc, spray and pray approach, I think is really meaningful for B2B brands.
Yeah, and don't neglect user-generated content either. It's not so much just about having an influencer post something on their own platforms. If they can create something that you can then use and add paid ad revenue to, I think, number one, you can negotiate that with the influencer because it's going to create increased engagement for them. That's something that can be mutually beneficial. But also, there are so many opportunities where, like, I don't know about you, but on TikTok, for instance, I see so many ads that just look like they're coming from small creators. But then you look at the handle and it's coming from like Hyatt or something of that nature, right? So taking advantage of all those sorts of things can really increase your reach and maybe make influencers and creators that were hesitant to work with you more willing.
I want to come back and touch on user-generated content for sure. But one of the things that I love to get your thoughts on is in-house influencers versus external influencers and what your thoughts are on that. And by that, I mean, recently I came across someone called Patrick Kelly, where Zoom has hired, and Patrick Kelly is this software engineer with a massive white beard. He works out, but he also is very knowledgeable about the enterprise landscape when it comes to unified communication. Super niche space, and he does a lot of work. He kind of is an internal influencer, but he creates content on YouTube and talks about, hey, if you're an enterprise organization thinking about Teams and thinking about Zoom, how you should kind of think about this, or you're thinking about unified communication, what your thoughts should be. What is your thinking when it comes to in-house influencers versus external influencers?
Yeah, I think there's always a place for using internal employees as advocates. Ideally, they know your organization really well, they know your brand values, and even if they're not maybe particularly in the specific niche that you're looking to acquire customers in, they can be used for so many other things, right? Like, recruitment and hiring, showcasing the values of your organization, and empowering your employees with the content and information to be able to do that at scale, I think is really powerful. I do think it is hard to build trust with potential customers if it's just you talking about how great your brand is. So I think in that example, I think it's fantastic that they have someone who is now internal, who is well respected in the industry and can be like an evangelist for their brand. I think to really amplify that, having that person partner with other external B2B influencers in the space could be really powerful. So, perhaps it's hosting a podcast or a webinar series where he then partners with people who are maybe going through that change process, thinking about shifting to their tool and what does that look like and why do they make that decision and what do the pain points look like, or interviewing people in aligned content verticals. Because of course, if it's just an internal employee at your organization saying, use our product, it's fantastic, it's the best product out there, obviously, a lot of people are not going to trust that because, of course, you've got a vested interest in them using your tool. So I definitely think there's a place for using internal advocates and, content creators or influencers, and they should definitely be a part of any good B2B influencer strategy. But definitely, I think, to really build that trust and credibility, it's about reaching audiences that are not necessarily just purely having a vested interest in the use of that one specific product.
Okay, that's fantastic. And I think that kind of dovetails really nicely with the next point that I want to talk about, user-generated content, okay? Where does that come in? Obviously, that is a little bit different than influencer marketing. And Joe, I know you touched on that. But when it comes to B2B, what are your thoughts on that front? Where does that come in? Where does UGC come in?
Yeah, sure. I think when it comes to UGC, it's all about pulling things from your own customer base if you can. And if you let them advertise their business at the same time, you're kind of like working in lockstep. The best way that I've kind of seen this happen is when you try to demo a specific product and get kind of a showcase from one of your other clients. And I've seen video type things where one company will reach out to another company that they're working with and agree to appear on a video for kind of an interview about how they use that product. And it gives both organizations the opportunity to advertise the services that they do. So bring your customers in as potential for what you can create for UGC. Beyond that, I think it's just about, putting out all the testimonials and all the positive feedback that you're probably already getting.
Okay. Are there strategies that you see organizations are using that it is very effective in terms of generating UGC? Are there organizations that come to mind and you're like, these guys are killing it with the way that they're implementing and capturing UGC?
Yeah, look, I think Canva does a fantastic job of it. They do an amazing job of showcasing everything from SMEs right through to larger businesses that use Canva and the different use cases and how they use them, and amazing content that they've made using Canva. I think even around Australia, you'll see like really big billboards featuring, business partners of Canva, which I think is really cool. Qantas does the same with their B2B customers. You've probably seen again some of their above the line ads showcasing, people who fly regularly with Qantas, why they fly, how Qantas business travel has made their lives easier. And for those organizations, it's an amazing, as Joe was touching on, it's an amazing opportunity to get huge exposure for their brands at scale. So I think exactly as Joe touched on, it's about trying to find those opportunities for it to be mutually beneficial for the person you're asking to advocate on behalf of your company and give a testimonial or appear in an ad campaign or video content. I think above and beyond, we have seen so many video content pieces being sort of the best use case. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. It is that sort of long form storytelling and people being able to speak to not just the perfect, shiny, I use this product, it was fantastic, 10 out of 10 would recommend, but being able to talk to some of the longer form things like, look, it probably took us a little bit longer to set up than we would have liked. And, we dropped the ball a little bit on this side, but, since we've got it integrated, we've found it's, increased our efficiency as a team 10 times and being able to give that really true testimonial and advocacy for the product. which I think is so much more believable for people who are listening to it or reading that. And I think anything that you can do to capture stats and data, people love seeing, it increased our, efficiencies by X%, or we reduced churn by X%. Any of those sort of really key takeaways that people can take back to their team or take back to their boss or the person making that purchasing decision and say, I really need to use this product or software or service because here's the things that I can do with it. And these 5 companies are using it. Here's some big names that I can speak to, and here's some of the results that they've seen. Those are the sort of key things that you want to try and think about incorporating in UGC.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And those examples are definitely both Canva and Qantas, great examples. Let's talk channels. Let's talk channels when it comes to B2B, especially around influencer marketing. Obviously, LinkedIn is massive in the B2B space, but Taryn, you were talking about how one should not be fixated, especially in the B2B space, should not be fixated on just LinkedIn. I'd love to hear from your side in terms of what are some of the channels that you're exploring. There's obviously the kind of first party channels or own channels, which is your email, your website, and all that stuff, which is fine. But I'd really love to hear your thoughts on the third party channels where we're talking about LinkedIn, but also what are some of the other channels that you're, again, as I said, you're experimenting with, you've seen success, or you've seen other organizations execute on really well, B2B organizations, especially when it comes to influencer marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think LinkedIn is the one that everyone goes, yes, I can get really granular and find my exact target audience there. And tick, yes, that is absolutely the case. I think, as Joe sort of touched on a little bit earlier, thinking about the ways that you can repurpose content or not just have content die in one place, I think is really, really important. So if you are going to the lengths of finding a great B2B influencer who has, a high reach or high authority on LinkedIn, well, how else can you use that content that you're going to work with on that person? How can you use it on different platforms? So, for example, I'm working on a campaign at the moment with Seek, which is a hiring platform. And that campaign is being executed on LinkedIn, Instagram in-feed posts, and Instagram stories because we can talk to different touch points and different types of customers and use different types of content across each of those different content types. And then they can use that content in their own newsletter marketing, and then they're using it for paid amplification and ads as well. So given you've found the right person, ideally, and you've engaged them to make some really meaningful content, thinking about the different types of platforms that might be relevant. So is it Threads, a platform where it's really easy? Obviously, Instagram is much harder to click straight through to a link. So is it Threads, where you can click straight through to a link, or Twitter/X, whatever we're calling it now? Like, is that a really good place where you've already created this great thought leadership piece, for example, or interview or white paper with this person? How else can that be distributed? Or if it's a video piece of content, can it then be cut down and used across Instagram Reels or Stories or TikTok, for example? Or can it be transcribed, and then can snippets of that be used as sort of really quick call outs on Twitter or Threads? So I think just thinking more meaningfully about using the same piece of content in different ways. So it's sort of perhaps a little bit of a bigger upfront investment from thinking about how to use the content and maybe spending that time, as Joe said, in working with the creator on how can we use this content in a way that's going to also benefit them. So it's more cost effective for you as a brand. So you can say, look, we're going to promote this to our newsletter database of X 100,000 people, which is going to get you this exposure. Can we do that at no cost or a lower cost than potentially what they would initially be thinking of charging if it was just being used for ad sets, for example? So I think thinking about that content plan upfront and how to do one shoot or one piece of content or one webinar and then cut it down into different pieces and cover all of those channels at once.
Taryn, one channel that I think is totally kind of unexplored and underrated that you make great use of at Gifted is like industry forums and like communities where like professionals are gathering together and, maybe you were part of some keynote speech or on a panel or something. It would be great to hear about how you use that as a channel to market to other businesses.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it just then, and tying back to what you were saying earlier about The strategy really came from thinking about the platforms or places that I go to get information that I need for us as a business and as a business person myself when I'm seeking out information. And from there, I thought, well, if these platforms or groups or events are useful to me, then hopefully they're useful to other people like me who might need a service like Hash Gifted in their business. So I sort of mapped out the landscape a little bit, and I wanted to make sure there wasn't too much overlap, and looked at the different types of events that were coming up on the calendar that would be relevant for us, and, got in touch with them about speaking at their events, partnering with them on their events, and how we could provide information to their customer base, whether that's, discount codes or free trials or, informative videos on how they could be, creating user-generated content through Hash Gifted. And then into some of these more engaged Facebook communities, for example, where they're always looking for great, fresh content to be able to help add value to their member bases. And just, again, reaching out to them really proactively and saying, hey, I think that we can help solve a problem for your organization. How can we work on for your members, how can we work on some content together that could be mutually beneficial? So I think, thinking about the, I guess, watering holes where you already go to get content yourself as a business person, and how could you interweave that with the story of your brand to drive those meaningful conversations?
I think on looking at watering holes that you're already looking at, one other channel is email marketing, not your own company newsletter, but like we said at the beginning, taking a look at the newsletters that you're currently reading. If you were able to get an ad in the Hustle's daily newsletter that they do, imagine what that would do for converting into new leads, especially if you were able to develop some sort of partnership with them where you can be a part of that newsletter for a week. So I think sharing influencer content even via email can target specific segments of your audience too.
Yeah, I think the email scene is exploding, and a lot of people talk about how email is dead, but then you see the rise of these subscription emails and email newsletters that there's room for sponsors. I'm totally with you on that front, Joe, where, again, it's a combination of leveraging these channels, but also influencer marketing, because you're kind of piggybacking on the back of these content creators and the audience that they've created. One probably last question that I want to touch on here is, Taryn, you touched on Threads, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that. As is that a viable channel? Is it too early still to kind of consider it? I know there are different thoughts on that, where some people say, hey, they didn't get it right. Some say, no, their distribution channel is going to make it work. What are your thoughts of Threads today, and do you see that as a viable channel, or is it still too early? It's early days.
It's so funny. I think the night that it was released, or it was night in Australia, I had so many clients get in touch with us going, oh my gosh, do I need a thread strategy now? What should my thread strategy be? What's it going to look like? Can you give me some inside info? And I was like, hot tip, we all just got access. There isn't a playbook yet. No one knows how this platform is going to unfold. I got access the same time you did. There's no secret formula here yet. And we don't know how people were going to adapt to it and use it. And there was a huge spike up front. And I think, they did some amazing gamification to make that early adoption, really happen. So props to them for delivering that. I think there was a huge early spike and a lot of early interest. And then I think that certainly died off. And, since the first 2 weeks of Threads, I haven't had a client get in touch asking at all whether or not they should incorporate that into their marketing mix as yet. I think in a lot of people's minds, Twitter just really never seemed to get off the ground in Australia, and wasn't really incorporated into many brands' marketing channels and marketing mix. And so I don't know whether it's the association between that, or that marketers are just so overwhelmed with all of the other channels that they have to fill that they're like, oh, park it in a bucket, see how it evolves over time, see if it becomes meaningful, and then come back and address it later. When they've got a little bit more headspace to think.
Got it. Okay. No, that's thank you very much for that. Now, before I got some rapid fire questions that I want to ask as well, but before we dive into that, is there anything else that you think we should touch on when it comes to B2B and influencer marketing? that maybe I didn't ask or we didn't have a chance to bring up?
I was just thinking off the back of what both you and Joe were saying before in that about email marketing. I think one thing we all suffer from as marketers is a lack of content, right? And I think, we're constantly struggling to find new, great, interesting, meaningful, engaging content to share with our audiences. And this, doesn't really necessarily just mean email. But if you can proactively as a marketer go out to aligned brands or newsletters you might want to be featured in with preset pieces of content saying, we would love to share this content with you. We think it would really align with your audience. Would you be interested in hosting it on your blog or including it in your newsletter? 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a yes. If it's high quality content that really solves a problem that isn't too salesy, we certainly get sent them. And I'm like, yes, fantastic. Thank you so much. A well-informed, well-written piece of content that includes a backlink to their company's site that is of value to my customer base. Absolutely. Of course, we would love to include it. So I think just keeping that in mind as a marketer, that we all face the same problems, and how can you use that as an opportunity for your brand to get in front of the right people?
You have started to roll out your ABM strategy, but you're starting to hit some roadblocks. You're finding everything extremely time-consuming and complicated. The technology landscape is baffling. Deployment support in your organization is non-existent. And to top things off, the sales team has no interest in participating. You know ABM can work for your business, but you're in desperate need of a push in the right direction. Chat to the APAC ABM experts at Xgrowth for a free consultation to help get you on the right track. For more information, check out xgrowth.com.au. That's xgrowth.com.au and get back on track today.
Let's do some rapid fire questions. First question I have, and I'd love to get this answer from both of you, is what is one resource, this could be book, blog, podcast, talk, whatever it is, that has had a profound impact on the way you work and live? Joe, you want to go first?
Sure. I have two to mention that kind of work in tangent together. The first one is a book called Leading Change at Work by Adam Brous, who's a product manager and a professor in San Francisco. And it really gave me the idea of how do we make corporate decisions and how can I take myself out of the equation from a emotional standpoint. And it works really well with Blue Fishing, which is the art of making things happen by Steve Sims. Teaches you how to catch that blue fish. And I think when you take the two together, it really empowers you to create effective change, not just at work, but in your own personal relationships and life. And then just as one last kind of shout out, my newsletter of choice today is the Trends newsletter. I learned about pickleball probably 7 months before everybody started picking up pickleball rackets and that sort of thing, but kind of a really great resource to know what's going on from a macro level in the corporate world.
Thanks for that, Joe. Taryn, what about you?
I have written down both of Joe's books because I definitely need to read them. I'm also addicted to the Trends newsletter. I think it's fantastic and just so many interesting snippets from so many different industry segments and verticals. So highly recommend that. For me, from a marketing perspective, I love the Prof G Show by Scott Galloway, the podcast. I listen to it 3 times a week. I just love his perspective on things and that he's not afraid to have an opinion. And I always feel like I come away from listening to those with some sort of nugget of insight or understanding or new way to view a problem. So I love that. I love someone who's a bit of a blue flame challenging thinker.
Yeah, you can't beat Prof G. You can't beat the dog. But no, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Second question is, if you could give one advice to B2B marketers, what would it be? Taryn, you go first.
Be collaborative, don't be dictatorial. So work with the creator or the B2B influencer, collaborate with them, find something that's mutually beneficial. Don't be prescriptive, don't be dictatorial. Let them use their own tone of voice and language, and it's going to be way more successful.
Yep, and I would say prioritize building genuine long-term relationships with influencers over the short-term gains that you could get.
Amen.
Amazing. Third question, who are some of the influencers you follow? Joe, you want to go first?
Sure. I think a big one in kind of the B2B marketing world is Neil Patel, but on kind of a more creative copywriting day-to-day side of things, I really like Anne Handley, who kind of teaches you how to like write ridiculously good marketing material, and her newsletter is just funny. One of those great kind of high-spirited shenanigans type thing. It's called Anarchy with 2 N's, like her first name Anne, but she's a great resource. Anne Handley.
Handley is great. Taryn, what do you got?
I'm definitely signing up for that. That sounds exactly like something I need. I'm personally a massive fan of Kara Swisher and totally fangirled all over her at South by Southwest, which Joe and I went to this year. I just think that she's, again, like, she captures that sort of big tech scene and the startup scene so well. I love her podcast. I love her newsletters. I love her sort of long form writing pieces as well. So she's definitely an influencer that I follow in the space.
Last question that I have is, what is something that excites you about B2B? And Joe, let's finish this. Let's go with you first for this last question.
I'd say kind of the increasing emphasis on like personalized strategies. It's kind of the reason why people are trying to, or corporations and organizations are trying to work with influencers beyond like, putting out a billboard ad or something. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention the integration that AI and automation could have. There's like great potential there for driving B2B growth and innovation.
Taryn, from your side?
I couldn't agree more in that the thing I'm most excited about is that brands are being forced to try new things. They can't just rely on, big, boring, traditional TV ads or billboards. They have to try new things. And I think that's really exciting because I think we are seeing brands try and do really cool things on Reddit forums or, making really great, meaningful collaborations with B2B influencers. And I think whilst, yes, it's scary, and I'm sure like for the marketers internally at these brands, dipping their toes in the water to working with, AI for the first time or influencers for the first time or whatever it might be that is, sort of outside of their usual scope of how they would market as a B2B marketer. I think it's super exciting because it's making much better content. And yeah, as Joe sort of said, that ability for it to be more personalized and more meaningful to the person receiving it, I think is super exciting.
Joe and Taryn, this has been an awesome conversation. I took a lot of notes. I'm going to be, I was just checking Trend's newsletter as well. I'm going to be jumping on that. Some great books as well. Just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for your time.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. This has been totally fun.
Today's episode of Growth Colony was produced by Alexander Hipwell and Liza Maywald. It was edited by Dave Samito with additional editing by Liza Maywald and music arrangement by Alexander and Liza. Special thanks to Tina Wabe. We couldn't make the show without you. Growth Colony is hosted by Shaheen Hoda, Director of Growth at Xgrowth. If you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe and give us a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Do you think you'd be a great guest or just keen for a chat? Send through an email at podcast@xgrowth.com.au. That's podcast@xgrowth.com.au. That's all for now. We'll catch you next week, right here on Growth Colony.